Hi folks, so we're finally at our first Arena laboratory, Lab 5. So I'm going to split this video up into 3 parts. The first section will be a brief introduction to Arena and the text that we'll use for Arena. The second part is going to be a guided tutorial where we will work together to build a model, and then hopefully when you come out of that you'll feel more comfortable working with Arena. And then the third part will actually be describing the laboratory exercise and what's expected of you when you turn in your lab report. You can watch all or some of those parts as you wish. That's why I've kind of split them up into 3 to make it more convenient for you. All right, so before we get into Arena, I did want to mention that you definitely need to get access to this textbook, the Simulation with Arena textbook from Kelton. There are a bunch of different editions of this text, and they're all basically identical. In the racket that is academic textbooks, this is probably one of the worst offenders in how similar editions are from one to the other. The newest editions may go over some of the slight changes Rockwell Automation has made in Arena to how it does scheduling, but it's a very, very minor change. And so most of them may not have exactly the same page numbers, but they have pretty much the same section numbers. So as long as you get access to some edition, you should be fine. Now throughout the semester, am going to make use of their exercises because I want you to get used to making use of the textbook, because we're not going to cover everything that you'll need for your final project. Some people are going to need some aspects of Arena where those might be totally irrelevant to others. So we're going to cover the basics, and then when you actually do your final project, then hopefully you'll become more comfortable with looking through, say, the table of contents up front, or the index in the back, to find those more advanced aspects of Arena that will help you with your particular problem that you're working with in your final project. And of course, the instructional staff can also help you, find things in Arena. But I definitely think whether it be an electronic copy or a hard copy, however you can, get access to this textbook, which I think is also in closed reserve in the library. All right, so let's move on to an introduction to Arena. So if you open up Arena, now you might say, well, how do I get Arena? Well, it should be on the laboratory computers that you're working on. Regardless of what platform you have, Windows or Mac, you can also, or Linux, remotely connect to the SIDC servers and actually run Arena remotely on machines that are here at ASU, but you'll actually be able to access them, and you can transfer files back and forth. And so that is another option, a sort of a popular option, to remote access to Arena. Now, if you want local access, you either have to have a Windows machine to install Arena, or you can install on a Mac or a Linux machine some parallelization solution like VirtualBox or VMware Fusion or Parallels, just to name a few. VirtualBox, I think, is actually a free solution, but regardless of which one of those you pick, then you have to find a copy of Windows to install on them, and then you'll end up running Windows in a virtual box, like a virtual window, and then you can install the free version of Arena, the student version of Arena, on top of that. The student version of Arena is limited to 150 entities at a time, which isn't normally a major problem for most of the models that we work on, but every once in a while we do push up against that limitation. And so we have in the past licensed commercial versions of Arena on the machines here at ASU that you could access from remote, but sometimes there's problems in opening files on something on either the commercial version in a student version or vice versa. And so I usually recommend, if you can, just to keep it all in the student version. But if you end up needing the commercial version, there's not that much you can do. So there are options for getting access to Arena. And if you're unclear about them, check the Canvas site and the syllabus, as I talk about those options there. And then otherwise, talk to the instructional staff. All right, so once you get Arena installed, open it up, and you would end up seeing something that looks like this. Well, of course, a model wouldn't be all the way built already, but you see a window that looks like this one. And so let's go over the components of that window and what we're looking at here. All right, so the flowchart view in here is where most of the modeling action goes on. So this is where we drag modules into and connect them up together in order to define the processes that we're modeling. So in order to get those modules, we find them on the left here. And so are these flowchart modules going to be wired together. And you can see this one is under this basic process section here. And we can find that you can actually install additional panels that have more complex modules than these right here. We're going to start out with these sort of basic process, but as we move on in the semester, we will start using some of the more advanced ones. So when you drag these flowchart modules on, you'll need to wire them together, and you can find a little wiring tool up here at the top of the window. And then that wiring tool is what we use to actually bring all these things together. At the bottom here, you see these data modules, and they kind of look like spreadsheets. And when you click on them, then they will end up changing this spreadsheet view down here, which I'll introduce formally in a slide or two. And so these things are actually used to configure different characteristics of the simulation beyond what's inside each of these individual modules. And so you can define what types of entities you have. You can define which attributes those entities have. You can define what types of resources you have. You can define how the queues work. Are they FIFO, etc. So this is where you find things that don't quite fit into a module that are somehow more kind of global than that. Then, like I said, when you click on those, you're pretty much going to it's going to change this spreadsheet view at the bottom window here. So when you click on those, you may notice nothing seems to happen. Well, what probably happened is the spreadsheet view changed, and that's where you can interact with, say, the resources and so on. All right, so if we zoom in here, on the basic process panel, we can see the kind of common modules that you're going to use, especially as you get started with Arena. So the two most common are create and dispose. These are what actually create entities, bring them into existence so they can move around the processes that you've sketched out. And then dispose is what actually collects them and gets rid of them, since frees them up. Because remember, the student version of Arena has this 150 entity limit. The process module, these rectangular ones here, are the ones that actually implement activities in Arena. So they are the places in which the entities meet the resources. And so in the process module, that's where you can say, when an entity comes into this process module, it needs these 1, 2, or 3 resources, and it's going to need them for this amount of time. And it will hold on to those resources for that amount of time, and then eventually let the entity go and then free those resources up for other entities. The decide module is a little different than that. It doesn't actually take any time, so entities don't spend any time in the decide module, but it can route entities around the flowchart. And so you can say, have a deterministic policy, so you can say all entities that have this particular attribute, all entities with the color red, all entities with an emergency, those sorts of things go out one path, and the other entities with, say, another attribute, or just everyone else, go out the other path. You can also make it probabilistic. So you can say half the time entities go out this way, 25% of the time they go out this way, and the other 25% of the time they go some other way. And so even though it's kind of drawn, so there's only a couple of different outputs, you can actually, if you put, say, 10 different outputs, it ends up drawing kind of a line down here that has a bunch of different outputs here. So the decide module is generally how you route things, either based on attribute or probabilistically. Then down here, this is kind of similar to in the muffin baking simulation of Lab 2. This is where you can do batching, where you take entities and you put them into a single batch, and then separation, where you can unpack those batches back out into entities. And then there are these assign and record modules, which help us do the kind of bookkeeping of simulation. And so the assign module, for example, an entity comes in there and its attributes can get updated with a particular value. So, it entered this region of the simulation, so we maybe want to keep track of the time at which it hit this particular point. And so we could save it using that assign module. Or in that assign module, we can update global variables. Like we might want to keep track of how many entities have gone through this point. So we might need to update some sort of global counter. So those are kind of the two things that we can do inside these assign modules. And then there's these record modules, which can actually take a measurement. So as an entity flows through there, it then triggers a measurement that could be made. And so you can measure, for example, the length of time in between entities that have arrived at that record module, or how many entities have arrived at that record module, and so on. Then if we come down to these data modules, then we've got this attribute and entity, which I've already sort of brought up already, that this, if you click on this attribute down in the spreadsheet view, then you'll end up being able to create a bunch of attributes like arrival time, for example, or whatever attribute you might want, like priority, those sorts of things. Things that you would like to add to entities, you can create there. And inside that spreadsheet view, you can do things like set their default value, for example. Now next to that, the entity here, this is where you could create different types of entities. You could create a person entity, a car entity, and so on. Now entities by default get a bunch of attributes that are just created for you. So for example, entities have a picture associated with them. And in the entity data module down in the spreadsheet view, after you click on it, you can adjust what picture is associated with that entity. But just like any other attribute, the picture can actually be changed by the simulation as the simulation is running. There's the queue and the resource data module, and so if you go into the resource data module, which we'll access more often early in the course, this is where we define all of the different types of resources. So there might be doctor resources, there might be nurse resources, there might be chair resources or room resources. So this is where we define all those different types of resources, and we can do things like setting how many resources are available, or how that availability changes over time, those sorts of things. Now there's a queuing module as well. So every time we create a process that accesses a resource, and that resource has a finite capacity so that entities have to wait on it to become available, then that process, which is those rectangular boxes from the previous slide, that process will create a queue. Now, how that queue brings entities out of it is sort of up to you. So you can define the queuing type here. So it can just be a simple first in, first out. Or you can assign priority. You can say grab the first entity waiting in the queue with the lowest priority, for example. And so this allows us to reshuffle how we're bringing entities out of the queue, making some entities wait longer even though they might have arrived earlier. And then the other one that we're not going to worry about some of these others for now, but the one I do want to focus on is variable. This is where you can create the global state variables, which would contrast with the attributes. So attributes are kind of like variables that ride alongside each particular entity, but a variable in this context here is something that we keep track of across the whole simulation. So if you wanted to keep a list of state variable, if you wanted to keep, let's say, a count of the number of times a particular thing happened in your simulation, then that would be something you could create a variable for. If you wanted to create a state that would keep track of whether, let's say, for example, you've got an inventory management simulation and you send an order out and you want to keep track of whether that order has been processed, well, then you might create a state variable that keeps track of whether there's currently an order out and whether you're still waiting for that order, and so on. So it's a way for you to create these global variables that you can then access throughout the simulation as if they're present for all of the entities, as opposed to the attributes where the value of each attribute changes as you go from entity to entity. All right, other modules. So I mentioned that that was the basic process panel. Now you're going to have to attach other panels for labs that require these additional panels. So if you right-click on the project bar, then you can go to Template Panel and say Attach. That will bring up this folder view here where you can, it should by default be in this, C, Program Files, Rockwell Software, Arena template. But if it's not, you'll have to select down through that. And then from there, you can select which of these Arena templates you want. So That was the basic process template, so you might install the blocks and the element one. So blocks and elements are actually sort of older Arena modules that are used, that are sort of more fundamental. They're more fine-grained, but they're also much more basic than even the basic process ones. But then the advanced process ones and advanced transfer ones are even more higher level. And so this is where you'd find things like modules that already do things like conveyor belts and carts and things like that. So we'll get into the advanced process and advanced transfer in a couple of labs from now. But this is where you'll end up finding those, and we'll remind you of that when you have to add them in future labs. All right, so once you've built a model, a flowchart model, what do? Well, just like in behavior space and NetLogo, you need to then set up the configuration of the experiment you're going to run in this simulation. So up at the top of Arena, there's a Run menu, and then down there you click Setup, and that opens up this Run Setup over here. Here's where you can set up the number of replications of the experiment. So how many times is it going to run this simulation until it ends, and then restart and run it again, possibly getting a different value. There are a bunch of other things that we don't talk about yet, but we'll eventually get to, like warm-up period, which is basically a period of time in which Arena throws away data before it starts keeping track of data. It lets your so-called transients die out. How long each replication is, so this is sort of how long the simulation goes before you start a new replication. And then time unit sort of things. And so we have the base time units are in hours, and so you want to remember that if there's ever a time that you do not specify a unit, then Arena will pick this one here. And then how many hours per day. And so in some simulations, you might say that you want to run it for, like the replication, you might want to run for 5 days, but you only want it to run 8 hours per day. So they try to do that to make it a little more convenient for you. So there are a bunch of other things up here that we're not going to go into, like run speed, run control, and so on, the visual designer, which are much more advanced, but this is where you configure all that stuff in Run Setup. All right, after you've got all that configured, then you can hit play in order to run your simulation. Now, next to it, there are additional steps here, so you can actually step through your simulation from event to event. So we've talked about the event calendar. Well, there is an event calendar that you can actually view inside Arena, and you can step from event to event to event with this button next to the play button, or you can fast forward all the way to the end of your simulation, which basically just turns off the visualization so it can finish as quickly as possible. Once your simulations are completed, you're going to get a little dialog box up that'll say, simulation complete, do you want to view the report? If you say no, you can click on this reports down here and you end up getting the same view that you would have gotten if you would have said yes. So basically, even if you don't have those little record modules, recording data that you can maybe look at later in Excel or R or SPSS or whatever, Arena will try to generate some basic statistics for you, and that's what you find down here in this reports. So you'll use that a lot. Now, when you're running a simulation, you can actually pause the simulation. And when you pause that simulation, then you might notice that the entities here, so in this case the entities are these little green dots and this one's a red dot, you can actually click on an entity or double click on the entity and it'll bring up an entity summary. And so you can actually drill down into an individual entity and ask them about their attributes. So this entity has a certain serial number, a certain type, a certain picture. It has different times, so this is where it automatically keeps track of things like when it arrived and so on. And then it's got user-defined attributes down here. So in this case, we've created a priority attribute, and this priority happens to be -1 for this particular entity. And so this is a way in which you can scrutinize entities to, say, debug your code to make sure that the flow is working as you'd expect. All right, now there are various times where you're going to write an expression, some sort of, it's kind of a mathematical expression that, for example, is going to specify which distribution that Arena is supposed to draw values out of. And so you'll get these expression boxes, and if you click on the little down arrow over here, then it will give you commonly used expressions for the particular context that you're interested in. So this particular one is a delay type, and it's giving you these distributions here that you might use for different types of delay. Now, a different option is you can actually right-click on that expression and then go down to Build Expression, or you can go to the Tools menu and go down to Expression Builder. And that brings up an extremely useful tool that a lot of students forget is there, the Expression Builder. In the Expression Builder, it's got these expression types, and you can go down through, it's got this nice hierarchy where you can drill down through the hierarchy, like in this case, entity-related variables, group member variables, attribute value of member. And so you end up getting this nice description. So you may not know what this means so far, but just trust me that eventually you'll get to a point where attribute value of member will actually make sense. But what you probably won't remember is these tiny abbreviated expressions like AG1, NSIM. Now that will end up making sense once you see it, but you probably won't remember it off the top of your head. But the Expression Builder allows you to sort of look for what you want here, configure what expression you would like to build here, and then it will give you that expression. And then you can just copy and paste that into the expression line you're looking for. So make use of the Expression Builder. A lot of times you'll learn things you didn't know you could do just by checking out what expressions are available in that Expression Builder. I would say the Expression Builder is maybe even more valuable than this Kelton et al. Textbook. Now, if you need more help, outside of the Expression Builder, outside of the textbook, then there are these help buttons that are scattered everywhere throughout Arena. It's kind of annoying where they are in Arena because depending on where you hit them, it will take you to different types of help. And so it's not just sort of a general help, although I'll show you where to find the general help. So in this particular case, let's say you forgot what the batch flowchart module does. I can drill down into the batch flowchart module, hit help, and it takes me to this nice page about the batch module. And if you look closely, there are these buttons: animation, example, prompts, remarks, main topic. Click on those. Examples can be extremely useful in finding quick, learn by example examples on how you would use a batch. Or if you just forget the syntax for how to do something in particular, the examples are often much quicker to get to than looking through some of the other things here. All right. So then finally, if then you want more help, go to that help menu, go down to Arena Product Manuals, and you should find a bunch of really great documents here that will help you with Arena and all the tools associated with Arena. I'd recommend the Getting Started with Arena, which is sort of like a combination help document and tutorial. It has a bunch of airport examples, which might actually be very relevant to some of you depending on your interests. So check out that. Now, if you like learning by example better, then under the File menu, there's something similar to the Models library in that logo. If you go under File, you can find Browse Examples and Browse Smarts, and that will just open up a folder of a bunch of examples or a bunch of these so-called smarts. Examples have complete and very complex simulation models for commonly encountered systems, hospitals, airports, etc. So if you want to see how you might model a sophisticated factory floor, check out some of the examples that are already in there. Now, if you're looking for small units that you might be able to reuse, like how do I open a file in Arena? How do I iterate through something in Arena? Those sorts of things. Then instead go to Browse Smarts, and you'll find in there small little units of code that may, if not tell you what to do, allow you to sort of copy and paste these little chunks that you might be able to make direct use of in your model. All right, so that's the end of this section. So section 2, we're going to walk through an Arena tutorial where you'll actually build a model with me that starts from the book. And then section 3, we'll actually talk about the lab exercise.